Tonight, dear listener, we drift softly into the quiet chambers of royalty, through silken canopies and candlelit corridors, through the whispers of time, into the night lives of kings, in a time before alarm clocks, before electric light, before modern luxury. There existed a kind of sleep known only to kings and queens. Deep within the stone walls of opulent chateaux and medieval palaces, the rulers of France lived lives that were as intricate in their slumber as they were in waking hours. Let us settle in gently. Close your eyes or soften your gaze. Listen as we wander through centuries of calm twilight, from the medieval courts of the Capetians to the sun-drenched boudoirs of Versailles. You're about to discover the sleeping habits of French kings in all their elegance, routine, and forgotten peculiarity. We won't rush. We'll take it slow, like a midnight breeze whispering past velvet drapes. Each step a lullaby, each memory a quiet sigh from history. Let your mind rest. Let your body sink. The journey is gentle, and it begins now. The royal bedchamber, where kings laid their crowns. Words. Approximately 1,000. We begin in the very heart of the king's sleeping world, the royal bedchamber. Not just a room for rest, but a stage for ceremony, privacy, and sometimes politics. In the earliest centuries of French monarchy, the days of the Capetian kings in the 10th and 11th centuries, the royal bedroom was more than just a place to sleep. It was a sanctified space, both sacred and symbolic. Kings like Hugh Capet and Robert II slept in rooms that were cool and stony. Walls were thick, windows were narrow, and silence hung heavy like a woolen curtain. Wooden floors creaked beneath fur rugs. The hearth at the center of the room offered the only warmth, with flames flickering orange and gold across walls hung with simple linen or painted tapestries. Beds were elevated, sometimes so high that stools or steps were required to climb in. The royal bed was often enclosed in thick, embroidered curtains, to trap heat and offer privacy from watching attendants. These curtains weren't just for comfort. In a world where kings were never truly alone, the drawn drapes symbolized rare moments of retreat. Sleep was taken seriously, not rushed, not stolen in haste. It began with rituals, a sip of spiced wine, prayers softly murmured, slippers removed by silent valets, and cloaks laid out for the morning. Even as time moved forward into the era of the Valois and Bourbons, some things remained the same. The bed was always central, large, imposing, carved from walnut or oak. Mattresses stuffed with feathers or horsehair, topped with layers of linen and silk. Pillows plumped and scented with lavender or herbs. Sheets aired in sunlight, folded with care. In these rooms, light was always gentle. Candles flickered slowly. Shadows danced across ceiling beams. A king's slumber was a carefully orchestrated pause in the day. The evening rituals, preparing the king for sleep. Words. 1,000. As twilight settled over the palace, a soft transition would begin. It was known as the coucher du roi, the king's bedtime ritual, a slow, ceremonial winding down of the royal day. This was not always a private affair. In the grandeur of the later Bourbon courts, particularly under Louis XIV, going to bed became part of a public routine. Yes, the Sun King, in all his splendor, was often watched as he prepared for slumber. It was a ritual that involved nobles, servants, and attendants of various ranks. At Versailles, the coucher began with formal announcements. Courtiers who were granted permission would enter the bedchamber and witness the king remove his ornate daywear, velvet coats, lace collars, satin breeches. Valets dressed him in a richly embroidered nightshirt, and in winter, perhaps a quilted robe lined with ermine. The ritual was slow, gentle, layers peeled away as the day was shed. Scented water was brought in silver basins to wash the kings. Hands a light supper might be taken, usually something simple, perhaps warm broth or a slice of fruit, nothing too heavy for digestion. The air might carry the faint scent of rosewater or orange blossom. The courtiers bowed. The chamber grew quiet. Candles were dimmed. The bed curtains were drawn. A final prayer, and then the king lay down. Louis XIV, despite his commanding presence, was known to follow this routine almost obsessively. It gave structure, predictability, a rhythm to days filled with power, ceremony, and responsibility. And so, with the hush of servants' footsteps and the soft creak of wooden doors, the royal chamber fell into stillness. The king slept, and so did the palace, sleeping through the ages from medieval kings to the Renaissance words, approximately 1,000 as centuries drifted onward. The sleeping habits of French kings evolved gently, like the slow unfolding of petals in spring, from the cold, fortified stone rooms of the early Capetian monarchs. The Renaissance brought not only art and learning, but also changes in how royalty slept. Kings like Francis I, who reigned in the early 1500s, brought Italian influence into France. Palaces such as Chambord and Fontainebleau were built with elegance in mind, airy galleries, larger windows, and more comfortable private chambers. The bed was still central, but now it stood beneath intricate ceilings and beside finely crafted fireplaces. Francis I favored warmth and softness. His beds were large, some said big enough to fit several people. Heavy curtains kept the chill at bay, and carved bedposts often bore the fleur-de-lis or delicate religious symbols. Velvet and brocade, dyed in rich indigo or emerald, made the bed a symbol of both rest and majesty. Sleep during this time still followed the natural rhythms of light and dark. With no clocks to wake them, kings might sleep in 2 segments, a common habit of the age. First sleep, then a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, and then second, sleep until morning. In that midnight interlude, a king might read by candlelight or listen to soft music from a lute in the next room. Some even prayed or dictated letters during those gentle, half-dreaming hours. The Renaissance brought beauty to slumber-refined linens, scented oils, and the understanding that rest was not just a bodily need. It was part of a cultivated life. The quiet hours of Versailles sleep behind golden walls. Words. Approximately 1,000 by the late 17th century, France had become the envy of Europe, and Versailles was its glittering crown. But even in this palace of mirrors and fountains, where sunlight poured into endless salons, sleep still came in soft silence. Louis XV, the great-grandson of the Sun King, inherited a world both opulent and exhausting. At Versailles, kings were constantly surrounded by advisors, noble women, bodyguards, artists, and servants. So the bedchamber became not only a sleeping place, but a sacred retreat. Louis XV's private apartments were smaller than his ancestors' grand chambers. They were warmer, more personal. Tapestries softened the walls. Bookshelves lined corners. Scented sachets rested in drawers. Here, the king could rest away from the rigid formality of court life. His sleeping routine was more modest than his grandfather's. He preferred to retire alone or with only a handful of trusted attendants. He would often sip warm milk or herbal infusions before bed. lavender, chamomile, sometimes lemon balm, believed to soothe the nerves and quiet the heart. The bed itself was crafted with elegance, gold trim, pale blue silk, and intricately embroidered pillows. In winter, fur-lined blankets and thick wool kept the cold at bay. The fireplace, constantly attended by servants, glowed with steady warmth through the night. Louis XV loved silence. In fact, many said his rooms were the quietest in Versailles. No loud clocks, no shoes clacking on the floors, only the crackle of fire and the occasional owl beyond the window. Sleepwear of kings, nightshirts, robes, and soft fabrics. Words, approximately 1,000. When one imagines a king asleep, it's easy to think only of the grand rooms and heavy drapes. But what of the garments they wore to bed? Sleepwear in royal France was a delicate matter, not flashy but finely crafted. Kings did not sleep in armor, nor in full formal attire. Instead, their nightclothes reflected the quieter side of luxury. Nightshirts were long and flowing, usually white, made of linen or cotton. They reached to the knees or lower, with subtle embroidery at the cuffs and collar. In colder months, a quilted robe might be worn over it, lined with silk or trimmed in ermine. The fabrics were always soft, breathable, and chosen with care. Louis XVI, for example, was known for his preference for comfort. His sleepwear was minimal, always clean, often scented lightly with rosewater. He disliked anything that felt restrictive. And while the world outside Versailles grew restless in the late 1700s, within his quiet rooms, he kept two simple routines: bath, prayer, nightshirt, then sleep. Slippers were worn until the last moment. A valet would remove them as the king sat on the bed. His feet were often rubbed with oils or warmed towels in winter. Even this small detail, the feel of linen on skin, mattered in the carefully preserved world of French royalty. It wasn't about extravagance, it was about gentleness, about care. Sleepless kings, insomnia in the palace words. Approximately 1,000 even kings, wrapped in velvet and silks, could find sleep elusive in the long nights at Versailles or the Château de Fontainebleau, when the wind howled softly against tall windows and the fire dwindled to embers. There were nights when slumber simply would not come. Louis XIII, for example, was known to suffer bouts of insomnia. A thoughtful and often melancholy king, he would lie awake staring at the embroidered canopy above him, listening to the ticking of a distant clock or the soft shift of guards outside his door. Some nights he would call for his court musicians to play gentle airs on viol or lute in an adjoining room. Other times he might walk slowly through the gallery, wrapped in his nightrobe, accompanied by a single candle-bearer. There was something meditative about these wanderings, the quiet echo of bare feet on parquet floors, the cool breath of night air seeping through stone corridors. Sometimes the king would pause at a window and look out into the darkness, the gardens below silent and sleeping, the moon casting silver across trimmed hedges. These moments were private, unrecorded in formal diaries, but remembered by valets and guards. Gentle hours where the king became just a man, restless like anyone, thinking quietly in his solitude to soothe himself. He might read from a favorite book, Psalms, perhaps, or poetry by candlelight, turning the pages slowly as the rest of the palace lay still. Eventually, sleep would come, softly, like mist settling on a lake. Sleep and the seasons, summer heat, winter chill words, Approximately 1000, the rhythm of royal sleep was deeply influenced by the passing seasons in summer. The sun lingered in the sky, casting golden light through palace windows well into the evening. The bedchambers, though elegant, could grow stifling in the heavy heat. Velvet curtains and feather-stuffed bedding were replaced by lighter fabrics, silk sheets, cotton nightshirts, fans placed near the bed. In the reign of King Henry IV, known for his fondness for simplicity, it was said that he preferred his windows open in summer, even when it let in the sound of frogs from the garden ponds. He liked the air fresh and moving. Sometimes he'd ask for lemon water or chilled wine before bed, served in delicate crystal. Sleep came slowly in the heat. The court would often retire late. Courtiers would stroll through moonlit gardens after dark, and the king might rest on a chaise lounge before finally retreating to bed. Winter, however, told a different tale. In the cold months, the royal chambers were sealed tightly. Heavy drapes lined the windows. Fires were lit early in the day and maintained throughout the night. Beds were piled with thick blankets, wool, fur, and embroidered quilts. Kings sometimes wore nightcaps to keep warm. Slippers were heated near the hearth before being worn. Basins of warm rose water soothed cold hands and feet. Even in all their luxury, kings were not immune to draughts or chill. Versailles, grand as it was, could be terribly cold in winter. Servants placed hot bricks, wrapped in cloth, beneath the sheets before the king retired. In these seasonal changes, the humanity of kings was laid bare. The rituals of sleep, adapting quietly to nature's rhythm. Guardians of the night, servants and sleepkeepers. Words, approximately 1000, though a king slept, the palace never fully did. Outside the bedchamber, quiet but vigilant figures moved through shadowed halls, servants, footmen, guards, and attendants, the keepers of royal rest. In Versailles, especially under Louis XIV and XV, the garde de nuit, the night guard, remained posted outside the king's door. They sat silently on stools or stood beneath flickering wall sconces, ensuring that no one disturbed the royal slumber beyond them. In nearby antechambers, valets remained on call through the night, ready to fetch water, rekindle the fire, or summon a physician should the king stir in discomfort. These men moved with practiced silence, gliding rather than walking, their steps softened by thick rugs. Some even slept on small folding beds outside the king's room, ready at a moment's notice. Their own dreams were shallow, brief, often interrupted. There were also chambermaids and linen keepers who worked after midnight, ensuring the beds were made, sheets were turned, and every item was in its rightful place for the next day. Even the royal dogs, often allowed to sleep at the foot of the bed, had their own attendants to bathe and brush them before nightfall. This invisible world of sleepkeepers ensured that, while the king drifted into dreams, his realm remained gently, guarded like a flame cupped by careful hands. The dreams of kings' imaginings beneath the crown words. Approximately 1000. What did kings dream of, as they lay beneath carved canopies and embroidered sheets? We will never know all their visions, but glimpses remain tucked into letters, whispered in diaries, murmured to trusted advisors over a drowsy morning. Louis XIV, despite his splendor and strength, was said to dream often of his youth. In the early hours, he would recall his boyhood at the Palais, long before he wore the golden robes of kingship. He spoke once of dreaming of his mother's voice, soft and clear, calling him to breakfast from a sunlit balcony. Francis I, the Renaissance king, was known to have vivid dreams, full of music, battlefields, and strange symbols. He sometimes called for artists to sketch the shapes and images he saw: spirals of stars, flying horses, staircases that led to nowhere. His dreams were considered part of his genius, mysterious glimpses into a mind full of wonder. Henry IV, the beloved king known for his kindness, once confessed in a letter that he dreamed of walking through meadows barefoot, far from court, the scent of lavender in the air. He longed, even in sleep, for simple joys, and Louis XVI, in the final days of his rule, was said to sleep uneasily. Yet even then, he spoke of seeing calm fields and churches in his dreams, places from his childhood, memories folded quietly in his subconscious. The dreams of kings remind us, beneath velvet and jewels, they too were fragile. Their hearts wandered in sleep, seeking comfort like yours does now. Awakening the king, gentle mornings in the palace words, approximately 1,000, just as falling asleep was ceremonial, so too was waking. The king's awakening, the lever du roi, was a ritual of its own, unfolding each morning in delicate steps, like the opening of a flower to light dot in the age of Louis XIV. This morning routine was both sacred and public. At a designated hour, often between 8 and 9 a.m., a knock would sound on the bedchamber door. The first valet entered, followed by a select group of nobles allowed to attend the king's rising. Curtains were drawn open, letting in soft, morning light filtered through lace. A warm cloth was offered to the king's hands, then a small cup of broth, or perhaps coffee in the later years. Fresh linens were brought for dressing. Valets and doctors might consult with him. The king would offer quiet greetings, sometimes commenting on the weather in this early hour. The palace came alive with whispers, servants preparing breakfast, bells ringing faintly down the halls, maids brushing rugs and opening shutters. But in the king's chamber, all remained slow and soft. Louis XV preferred a quieter morning than his great-grandfather. He liked to linger in bed, reading letters, sipping warm milk, and letting the day unfold gently. His dogs, often curled at the foot of the bed, were stroked while ministers waited patiently in the outer room. This rising ritual was not rushed. It was a slow return to the world, the bridge between the serenity of sleep and the noise of court, the symbol of royal sleep, power, privacy, and peace words. Approximately 1,000 sleep, for kings, was more than rest. It was symbolic. The bedchamber was one of the few spaces where a king could be seen not as a monarch, but as a man, vulnerable, private, and unguarded. In a world where every action was recorded, where gestures and glances were studied by hundreds, the king's sleep was one of the only untouched sanctuaries. To lie down in sleep was, in a way, to surrender, to remove the crown, to lay aside judgment, decree, and rule, and return, if only for a few hours, to oneself. This is why the bedroom, the bed, and even the sleepwear of royalty were treated with reverence. Why certain nobles were given the rare privilege to attend the couture or lever. Why candles were snuffed in solemnity and curtains drawn with care. Royal sleep was also about legacy. Many kings from Charles V to Louis XVI kept private diaries at their bedside. In those final thoughts before sleep, they recorded reflections, regrets, and prayers. Some believed dreams held divine meaning. Others found peace in simply letting go the rituals that surrounded royal slumber. From lavender sachets to silver-handled warming pans, all spoke to a quiet truth that even in lives of noise and grandeur, Kings needed peace, just like we all do. Sleep and companionship, queens, mistresses, and the royal bed words, approximately 1,000. Though the king's bed was often large and grand, it was not always shared, at least not in the way one might imagine. In the earlier centuries of the French monarchy, kings and queens had separate sleeping chambers. This wasn't out of emotional distance, but out of formality, comfort, and tradition. These arrangements allowed both privacy and dignity, and ensured that royal routines and rituals could be carried out smoothly. The queen would often have her own suite nearby, equally elegant, with her own attendants, rituals, and personal space. When intimacy was desired, or when heirs were to be conceived, the king would visit the queen's chamber, and then return quietly to his own. Louis XIV famously maintained this tradition at Versailles. His evenings were often carefully choreographed. After the public couture, he would sometimes retire not to his great bed, but to one of his private apartments, where a mistress like Madame de Montespan or Madame de Maintenon might await him. These chambers were cozier, less grand, and more human. The presence of a mistress didn't eliminate routine. Attendants still laid out robes and nightshirts. Candles were lit, herbal waters were placed nearby, and the atmosphere remained one of gentle ritual. There were also nights when the king simply slept alone, not from loneliness, but from preference. Even surrounded by courtiers and companionship, kings often craved the comfort of solitude, of drifting into sleep with only the sounds of fire and wind to keep them company. Sleep, even in shared beds, was treated with reverence. Conversation was hushed, movement slow, bodies wrapped in warmth and scent. A royal bed was not merely a place of romance or obligation, it was a sanctuary of the soul, training royal sleep, the slumber of princes and princesses. Words, approximately 1,000, just as kings had their sleeping customs. So too did the young heirs of France. Royal children were raised with precise habits, and sleep was one of the most carefully shaped. From infancy, their sleeping quarters were attended by nurses, governesses, and valets, each assigned specific roles, day and night, in the grand nursery of Versailles. Sunlight would filter in during the day, but at night the windows were shuttered tightly. The cribs were often ornately carved, but still practical, padded with soft linen, with canopies to keep out the chill. Infants were wrapped in swaddling cloths, soothed with lullabies, and laid down with silver rattles nearby. Lavender, sachets, or soft rose petals were placed inside the bedclothes to help calm them. It was believed that fragrance had the power to ease the spirit. As children grew older, their rooms became miniatures of the adult suites, smaller beds, lighter curtains, simpler tapestries, but still the nightly routine remained sacred. Hands were washed, prayers recited, robes donned. Dauphins, the heirs to the throne, were taught to sleep with dignity, to rise gracefully, to move quietly, and to never cry loudly during the night. Sleep was training for rule. Peaceful nights were seen as a reflection of future composure. Little girls of the royal court, princesses and duchesses, were often lulled to sleep by music or whispered stories from maids. Tales of chivalry, fairies, and ancient saints were told gently by candlelight, the soft voice of a nurse blending with the hush of the room. And when the palace grew completely quiet, the halls echoed only with the slow breath of sleeping royalty from the cradle to the crown. Sleep as medicine, royal health, and restful remedies. Words, approximately 1,000 in the royal courts of France. Sleep was not only a habit, it was considered a remedy. a balm for the body and mind. Doctors and physicians who served the king paid close attention to rest. They believed that good sleep strengthened the humors, restored balance, and cured maladies of both the spirit and the stomach. When a king was unwell, whether with fever, melancholy, or indigestion, the first prescription was often rest. Rooms were darkened, music was silenced. The king would be placed under a lighter coverlet, given a calming draught, perhaps poppy syrup, or a blend of valerian and chamomile, and instructed to sleep. Sometimes the bed was moved closer to the fire. Other times, windows were opened to let in night air scented with orange blossoms or pine needles. The goal was to create a perfect harmony, warmth, stillness, softness. Louis XIV's doctors recorded numerous sleep remedies in their journals. One involved rubbing the king's feet with warm almond oil, followed by a quiet reading of scripture. Another required a special linen pillow filled with hops and lavender. For stomach troubles, the king might drink a tisane before bed, a gentle tea made from lemon balm, verbena, or fennel. Always sipped slowly, with the flicker of candlelight calming the senses. Even the mattresses were considered tools of health. They were fluffed and aired daily, and special cushions were sometimes used to elevate the legs or head, depending on the king's condition. Above all, the royal belief was this: deep, untroubled sleep could do more for the king than any physician's scalpel. The sound of silence, nocturnal stillness in the royal court words, approximately 1000 when the final candle was snuffed, when the last footsteps faded into velvet hush. Only then did the palaces of France reveal their truest sound. Silence, yet even that silence was not complete. It was a silence made of softness, layered with gentle echoes, creaking timbers, and the occasional whisper of fabric moving in. The dark dot in the great halls of Versailles and Fontainebleau, silence was guarded. Heavy curtains were drawn not only to keep in warmth, but to muffle noise. Attendants wore soft-soled shoes. Doors were padded or fitted with felt to prevent their slam. Time itself seemed to slow after dark. Still, faint sounds floated through the night: the distant clatter of horse hooves outside the palace gates, the wind curling past chimneys and towers, the soft murmur of fountains in the garden, still running by moonlight, and occasionally the ghostly call of a night bird, carried gently across the manicured trees within the bedchamber. More intimate sounds filled the space: the rustle of linen as the king turned beneath the sheets, the rhythmic crackling of firewood settling in the hearth, the faint chime of a distant clock marking the hour. Louis XV once wrote that he could not sleep without the gentle splash of water in the fountains below his window, a lullaby of stone and water. This was the soundscape of kings, neither loud nor dead silent, but alive with subtle grace. A palace breathing slowly in its sleep, sleeping on the move, royal rest in travelling courts. Words, approximately 1000, while the grand palaces were homes of rest. French kings often slept far from them during campaigns, diplomatic journeys, or hunting. Expeditions. Travel was common for monarchs before the age of absolute rule. In the Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance, kings like Charles V or Louis XI maintained itinerant courts, bringing their households with them as they moved across France. Even in travel, sleep was ritualized. Royal tents were erected swiftly by servants. These were no ordinary campsites. The king's sleeping tent was spacious, draped in richly dyed cloth, often lined with fur or embroidered fabrics. A portable wooden bed was assembled, complete with mattress, linens, and canopies to offer privacy. In cold weather, braziers were placed nearby. In warm climates, ventilation slits were opened. Night sounds were different here. The rustling of canvas, the calls of sentries, the low murmurs of horses and men beyond the campfire. Sometimes the king would stay in monasteries or noble manors, their guest rooms hurriedly prepared by hosts eager to please. Straw was freshened, bed linens borrowed or rushed in from nearby towns. Food and drink for the evening were arranged hastily, warm stews, simple breads, and wine served in modest goblets. Despite the change of surroundings, familiar objects travelled with the king: a personal pillow, a favorite candle holder, a small devotional book. These small comforts helped him rest. Even in motion, even amid diplomacy or battle, sleep remained sacred, a place of pause, a breath between burdens. Exiled dreams, the sleep of kings without thrones. Words. Approximately 1,000 not all kings died in their beds, and not all slumber was peaceful. There were times when kings of France slept without power, far from their palaces, wrapped not in silk, but in uncertainty. Louis XVI, in the final days before the fall of the monarchy, found himself confined within the Tuileries Palace. Though still technically king, his bedchamber no longer belonged to him. Guards stood watch not out of loyalty, but out of suspicion. His sheets were inspected, his meals tasted for poison. At night he was restless, yet, even in these days, he tried to keep his rituals. He read from scripture before bed. He kissed his children on the forehead, and he prayed not for escape, but for clarity and peace. After the monarchy fell, he was moved to the temple prison. His cell was small, the bed narrow, a single candle, a thin blanket, but still he slept, softly, quietly, not always easily, but with dignity. There is a kind of nobility in the sleep of those who have lost everything, and long before him, there were other kings who tasted exile. John II, captured in England. Henry III, driven from Paris. Each found rest in foreign lands, in abbeys, in inns, in borrowed rooms with unfamiliar ceilings. Even stripped of titles and ceremony, they carried their sleep with them, like a final possession no one could steal. Because when the world outside trembled and turned, sleep was still a refuge, a place where crowns didn't matter, and dreams could still be sweet. Sleep and the sacred, the role of religion in royal rest. Words. Approximately 1,000 in the candlelit hush before sleep. The kings of France turned not just to comfort, but to prayer. Religion was more than a morning ritual or public ceremony. It shaped even the private silence of night. Sleep, after all, was seen not only as rest, but as a sacred act. A moment when the soul stepped slightly out of the body, drifting, resting, perhaps even speaking to God in dreams. Many kings kept devotional books beside their beds. Some, like St. Louis IX, were known to read psalms or chant quiet prayers just before lying down. Others would trace the sign of the cross upon their pillows, whispering invocations for protection through the night. In medieval times, sleeping without prayer was considered risky. The night was full of unseen forces. Dreams could be divine or deceptive. A restless night might be a sign of sin or a warning from heaven. Some kings even had confessions before bed, especially when traveling or at war. Chaplains and priests would sit quietly at the edge of the chamber, heads bowed, while the monarch released the burdens of the day. And in certain rooms, particularly in monasteries or religious palaces. Like Saint Denis, relics were placed. Near the bed, a saint's bone, a scrap of cloth, a holy cross. These sacred tokens were believed to guard the king's slumber. Even the architecture reflected this faith. In royal apartments, alcoves were carved for tiny shrines. Candles flickered before painted icons of the Virgin Mary, quietly watching. Over the bed, it was a world where the line between sleep and the spirit was thin. A gentle surrender, wrapped in ritual and reverence, dreams, omens, and the king's astrologer words, approximately 1,000 to dream, for a French king was no small matter. While common folk might see dreams as stories of the mind, kings often saw them as messages, hints from beyond the veil of reason. Throughout centuries, monarchs employed astrologers and dream interpreters, whose task was to read the stars and listen for the truths that dreams might hide. Louis XI, superstitious and anxious, would often consult seers and soothsayers about the meanings of his night visions. He feared ill omens, and once refused to travel for days after dreaming of a collapsing bridge. Catherine de' Medici, queen consort and regent to several French kings, was known to sleep with celestial charts beneath her pillow. Her son, Charles IX, had nightmares that his mother insisted were prophecies, and brought in astrologers to decipher them, and at court, it was not unusual for dreams to become gossip. A chambermaid's strange vision, whispered to the wrong ear, might end in exile. A royal nightmare might delay political decisions. Some kings embraced the stars openly. Henry IV was fond of his personal astrologer, who often predicted the best nights to sign treaties or make public appearances. Even Napoleon, though later believed in the power of dreams and omens, a legacy of the kings before him. In the royal bedchambers, celestial tapestries were sometimes hung, not just for beauty, but for comfort. The zodiac watched silently as the king slept. Stars embroidered in silver thread reflected softly in the candlelight. The skies spoke quietly. The king listened with closed eyes. The final rest, deathbeds, and last slumbers of kings' words. Approximately 1,000 even kings, wrapped in velvet and guarded by gold, must one day close their eyes forever. The final sleep of a French monarch was a solemn and sacred moment, not feared but prepared for, just as one prepared for war or feast. There was ceremony, there were prayers, and above all, there was quiet. Louis XIV, the Sun King, died after a slow decline. For weeks, his bed became a chapel. Physicians moved silently. Priests murmured prayers. Family gathered in shifts, each taking turns at his bedside. He lay beneath. White linen embroidered with gold thread, his breathing soft, his eyelids fluttering like candlelight in the wind. He died just before dawn, the world outside still hushed, the palace holding its breath. Long before him, King St. Louis died far from France. During a crusade, beneath a makeshift canopy in Tunis, his final moments were spent facing a cross, whispering psalms, a saint in his sleep. Henry IV, on the other hand, met his end suddenly, but even then, his attendants arranged his body for its final rest with reverence. The bed was straightened, the sheets smoothed, candles placed at each corner. For kings, death was not an end, but a final ritual of sleep. The royal bedchambers became sacred spaces, curtains drawn, windows opened so the soul might rise, perfumed water sprinkled over the linens, bells tolled in the chapel below, and then silence, the kind of silence that wraps the world when a story finishes and the page turns gently into eternity, the royal legacy of sleep beds that survived time words, approximately 1,000. Long after the kings themselves faded into history, their beds remained. Some were carefully preserved, not as mere furniture, but as relics of royal life. The bed of Francis I, richly carved and towering like a throne, can still be seen in the Château de Chambord. Its dark wood is worn smooth by time, but the craftsmanship remains breathtaking. Every scroll, every pattern tells a story, not of politics or war, but of rest. At Versailles, too, you can find the majestic bed of Louis XIV, the center of ritual and court life. Once surrounded by courtiers who watched as the king awoke and retired, that bed, covered in golden embroidery and canopied in royal blue, stood not just as a place of sleep, but as a symbol of power. In museums across France, pieces of royal bedrooms have been preserved. A silk pillow, stitched with a headboard painted with the signs of the zodiac. Even personal items, sleep masks, lace-trimmed nightshirts, and carved prayer stools are displayed in quiet glass cases, speaking softly to visitors about a world long gone. These objects remind us that kings were human. They too needed comfort, warmth, softness. They too had favorite pillows and rooms where they felt most at ease. Some of these beds have been restored. Others remain untouched, left exactly as they were centuries ago. The sheets have been changed, the mattresses replaced, but the spirit remains. A kind of hush lingers in the wood. They are monuments not to conquest, but to quiet, to sleep, and in this way, the kings of France still slumber, in rooms filled with history, candlelight, and dreams. The bed as a stage, rituals of awakening and sleeping words. Approximately 1,000. To sleep as a French king was not just private, sometimes it was public, especially in the time of Louis XIV. The royal bed became a stage. There were two ceremonies, la lever, the king's rising, and la couche, the king's going to bed. These were formal affairs, with carefully chosen courtiers allowed into the royal bedchamber to watch or assist the king as he awoke or prepared to sleep. It might seem strange now to imagine an audience at bedtime, but in the world of the absolute monarchy, every part of the king's day was a ritual. Even his yawn, his stretch, his final glance at the candlelight dot before bed. An official would help remove the king's heavy, embroidered coat. Another might present a nightcap. Someone would bring holy water, someone else a silk robe. The bed, though vast and canopied, was not always where the king actually slept. Often he would move to a smaller, private bed after the ceremony, yet the ritual was important. It reassured the court that all was well. It reminded everyone of the structure, the hierarchy, even at bedtime. In the morning, a similar scene played out. The great bed would be surrounded again, and the king would be greeted by a select few. His day began in full view. But in between these acts, in the privacy of true sleep, the king was once more simply human. These routines may feel distant now, but they remind us that even grandeur has rhythm, that even kings needed transition, comfort, and slow ceremony to ease into rest. A soft farewell, the dream of history words, approximately 1,000, and now, as the candle burns low and the night deepens, we begin to drift away from the world of kings and castles. You've walked quietly through centuries of royal sleep. You've seen the flicker of candlelight on ancient wood, heard the rustle of silk, the quiet breath of ritual, and the echo of dreams spoken in long-lost languages. From the Early kings who prayed beside their straw-filled mattresses to the opulent rituals of Versailles. We've wandered not through politics or war, but through softness, through chambers of peace, of intimacy, of quiet. Sleep, for the kings of France, was both a necessity and a symbol. It was surrounded by faith, guarded by tradition, and touched by dreams. And tonight, perhaps their calm can be yours. Let your breath slow, feel the weight of the blankets around you. Let the ancient hush of stone walls and velvet drapes settle softly into your thoughts. Somewhere in the silence of time, a king sleeps. And now, so may you, good night, gentle traveler of history. Sleep well.